Hello, my name is Ryan and welcome to RWBY In-Depth Analysis, now with an actual microphone. This week, I'll be analyzing the very first full chapter of RWBY, Volume 1, Chapter 1, Ruby Rose. First of all, I'll clarify the terminology here. In RWBY, each episode is called a chapter, and each season is called a volume. Furthermore, each group of 3 volumes makes a cohesive set, which I'll be calling arcs. Each of these arcs are unified by common themes and a more flexible common setting. The first arc takes place entirely in Vale, the second focuses on Mistral, the third in Atlas, and the fourth and presumably final arc will be set in Vacuo. The defining feature of each arc, however, are the themes connecting each volume in them. This first arc, set almost entirely at Beacon and in Vale, is primarily about choice. I'll be explaining this throughout the first 3 volumes. This structure isn't random, and more or less confirmed by the creators as intentional. The reason they started calling them volumes is because they didn't have the budget to do everything they wanted in the first season, so they split it into 2 volumes. As they got to Volume 2, they realized they'd still need more time, and so Volume 3 was born, and by then they just stuck with that structure. Ruby Rose, the very first chapter of RWBY, aired for the first time on July 5th, 2013 at the 3rd RTX, the official Rooster Teeth convention. It premiered online 13 days later, on July 18th, and on YouTube on July 25th. It is currently the only chapter of RWBY still uploaded to YouTube on an official channel, sitting at 17 million views. The chapter begins with narration. Legends, stories scattered through time. With this opening line, the so-called mysterious narrator has framed the entirety of what is to come as a legend, a fairy tale. This is made even more explicit when the narrator describes herself as a remnant of a forgotten past. The word she uses is we, which to a first-time viewer could give the impression of an inclusive meaning, that everything is a remnant. This is supported by the fact that, later on, it's unceremoniously revealed that the name of the entire world is Remnant. However, a double meaning is also possible. As we'll see shortly, the intended audience for this narration is not the viewers. The narration continues, explaining some of the core concepts of the world, Grimm, dust, and the dire nature of the struggle between them. The language used is neutral and impartial, set apart from the plight of mankind that it describes, and simultaneously it is steeped in metaphor and symbolism, describing mankind as born from dust, the Grimm as an inevitable darkness, and dust itself as both appropriately named, implying a connection to the origin of mankind, and as nature's wrath. While it is quick, a core theme of the show is also stated explicitly here. Even the smallest spark of hope is enough to ignite change. The music that plays over this sequence is entirely unique, with nothing like it playing anywhere else in the show, as is the animation. While it is likely that this is simply because they were still settling on a style for the show, I would not be entirely surprised if someday this music returns in an important scene. Similarly, we are shown a world map that includes details that are later changed, such as the continent in the northeast, which is entirely removed in later maps, and a lore-important island, Vital, which is entirely missing in this representation. The narration takes a darker tone, describing in flowery language how civilization will flicker and die, and darkness will return. This leads us to my first official hot take. RWBY is a slow burn apocalypse story. I'll explain more as we continue this series. The 2D animation gives way to the show's standard 3D animation, rendered in Poser, opening, of course, on the broken moon hung in the sky. We see Roman Torchwick stalking the streets with the uniformed gang members we saw him hiring from Junior in the Yellow trailer. Here, we also see again how background characters are rendered as silhouettes. This was done in the first volume to save money, as the budget was quite restricted. There will be many cases throughout this first volume of animation decisions made to save resources. In the background, as Roman and his hired help walk down the alley, we can see what is a scarf from Doctor Who hanging from a clothesline. The music also shifts to Roman's leitmotif, intriguing but sinister. The mysterious narrator shifts from exposition to dialogue, speaking directly to an unknown character. This sets the narrator as being a character in-universe, and one with stakes and goals relevant to the plot. But of course it takes a whole 3 volumes for this to pay off, and for Salem to be properly introduced. The things she mentions here are also highly relevant to the plot as a whole. Your guardians could refer to huntsmen or specifically to the maidens. Monuments to a so-called free world could be the academies or CCT towers. And of course, there will be no victory in strength is one of the recurring and core themes of the show. Even without the future knowledge of who this mysterious narrator is, we can glean some insight into her. Guardians implies that she is the one on the offensive, attacking something, and her enemies are the ones defending something. And what that something is must be the free world, which she refers to with disdain or contempt. This could imply a few different things. She could be opposed to the statement that the world is free, opposed to the idea of a free world altogether, or some mixture of the two. With what we know of Salem from future volumes, it seems likely that she simply finds the idea of trying to improve the world for its inhabitants pathetic. She views the world of Remnant as ruined, and its inhabitants as worthless. And, by stating that her enemies won't be victorious in strength, of course implies that she is weak, and they are strong, but that she is confident in her victory. This also sets the central conflict of the show, whatever it may be, as inherently adversarial and hostile. It is a war. As Roman and his gangsters enter the shop from dusk till dawn, a shop which sells the previously mentioned dust, a new voice replies to the mysterious narrator's threatening proclamation. Instead of denying her claim that there will be no victory through strength, he instead ponders that,
but perhaps victory is in the simpler things that you've long forgotten, things that require a smaller, more honest soul.
While this is all very vague and mysterious, we can still glean some meaning here. First of all, we see, or rather hear, the true intended audience for the mysterious narrator's monologue. As stated earlier, this shifts the implied meaning of the line, "We ourselves are remnants," from encompassing the whole world to just these two, narrators. Interestingly, as we learn later, both interpretations could be considered correct. Both the world of the show itself, as well as these two immortals, are remnants of a forgotten past, forgotten by all except them. In contrast to Salem, with her sheer confidence, this narrator, who we find out is Ozpin later this chapter, is almost humble, saying, perhaps victory can be found this way, and by someone other than himself. The implication is that, despite being stronger in some way, he is not confident that he will win, and is looking elsewhere for alternative ways of achieving victory, to a smaller, more honest soul, whoever that may be. The meaning of this is of course vague, even though it is one of the most iconic and thematically important lines in the entire show. Without delving too deeply into my interpretation of it, I would say that what Ozpin means here is that Salem, despite all her scheming and manipulation, has forgotten those things that drive average people. Love, compassion, hope, trust in one another. And those things are why she'll lose. With that, we can finally move on from the opening narration. Inside the dust shop, the camera pans down to reveal a familiar red hood, just as Ozpin's narration is mentioning a smaller, more honest soul. This shot can communicate a few more subtle things about the world. For starters, the existence of a dust shop implies how ubiquitous and important dust must be in the world. We can also see that RWBY is reading a magazine, Weapons Magazine, which is both a pun and a fitting name for what is presumably a magazine about weapons. This reinforces the idea that the world of RWBY is both dangerous enough that weapons are common, and free enough that people can take an interest in those weapons. As we'll see in future chapters, the diversity and uniqueness in weapon design is an extremely important piece of symbolism in the show. Additionally, on the back cover of the magazine, there is a full-page ad for what we now know as the Schnee Dust Company. This shows, beyond the crates we see on the train in the black trailer, how ubiquitous and powerful this company is. It also reinforces the connection between Weiss and Snow White by making direct reference to it. Some more references. Apparently, this magazine behind RWBY is a reference to Full Metal Alchemist. I haven't seen it, so I can neither confirm nor deny. And, more wholesomely, this henchman and the other that speaks this chapter are voiced by two children from Make-A-Wish, William Lopez and Isaiah Torres. Roman and his goons confront the shopkeep, a recurring minor character, with Roman coming off as confident and suave. We learn that in the world of Remnant, money is called lien, a real-world financial term meaning the legal claim a creditor has on a debtor's property, although it is consistently pronounced differently in the show. Lien were stated by Miles Luna to be approximately equal in value to the Japanese yen. Instead of taking the old man's money, Roman instructs his men to grab the dust. Upon reflection, this is both odd and concerning. The real-world equivalent would be a group of armed men robbing a gas station and taking only the gasoline. As the plot progresses, we learn exactly how nefarious their plans are and who's behind them. Thankfully, Ruby Rose is here to stop them. After a brief and comedic interaction, which shows Ruby as being completely unconcerned and even amused in the face of an armed man explicitly threatening her, she sends him and another gangster flying out of the shop, smashing the window. The next shot of Ruby slowly rising from the street as Crescent Rose unfolds over her shoulder, all to the tune of the main theme of the volume, This Will Be the Day, is truly iconic. I'll talk more about This Will Be the Day at the end of the chapter, but it's interesting to note that its appearance in this scene, emanating from Ruby's custom Rose headphones, makes it the only of the volume themes to be diegetic. Her expression is both enthusiastic and determined. Roman, meanwhile, is pissed. Roman orders his men to get her, and Ruby proceeds to wipe the floor with them. Her fighting style, as we've seen previously, is aggressive, fast-paced, using rapid movements and propelling herself with Crescent Rose, dancing around it, using its mass to swing herself around. Unlike in the Red trailer, however, she is making a pointed effort to use the dull edge of Crescent Rose, kicking with her feet, and not using her rifle on them. With sirens in the background, Roman, deciding to make a hasty getaway, reveals his cane as a weapon, a firework launcher. Like every character's weapon, his cane, named Melodic Cudgel, not that it's ever stated in the show, is a perfect reflection of his character. Sneaky, stylish, but brutal when put to use. Roman himself, in this short exchange, shows himself to be a sarcastic, smooth-talking criminal. His two primary allusions are Candlewick from Pinocchio and the character Alexander Delarge from A Clockwork Orange, but these are primarily only reflected in his name and design, and have little effect on the story. Here he also makes the first use of his nickname for Ruby, Little Red, another reference to Ruby's illusion. Ruby dodges his attack by launching herself straight into the air. By the time she lands and reorients herself, Roman has somehow made it halfway up a ladder across the street, in about 2 seconds. Before she gives chase, she asks the shopkeep if he'll be okay, showcasing one of her core character traits, compassion and thoughtfulness. As Ruby chases him to the roof, the shattered moon looming large behind her, the music transitions into a tense, dramatic rendition of Red Like Roses, her leitmotif. The tone shifting from more lighthearted, energetic but playful, into something more momentous. Roman doesn't even bother turning to face her as she confronts him. I don't think he actually cares so little about her. If he didn't think she was a threat to him, he wouldn't be running. But he is simply too much of a showman, too occupied with looking good to allow himself to appear like he feels threatened. In a very dramatic escalation, a VTOL aircraft rises from the alley in front of them. A bullhead, a twin-engine tiltjet that we see often in the first 3 volumes, seemingly common in Vale. We can see that Ruby is actually taken off guard, even more so than when she was assaulted by armed gangsters in public. This is not a normal night for Ruby. Roman, after climbing aboard, tosses Ruby a dust crystal, burn or fire dust, and fires at it. Again, Ruby is clearly taken off guard here, barely reacting to his attack. While it's unlikely this would have actually hurt her in any way, it's also clear that she doesn't know what to make of it, and doesn't know what to do in response to this sudden escalation. Thankfully, descending from the sky at the last possible moment, and interrupting Roman's maniacal laughter, is a mysterious woman, Glinda Goodwitch, as we learn later this chapter. Ruby's expression, the camera lingering and panning around her, and the sudden shift in music to her own leitmotif, informs the audience that wonder and admiration is the appropriate response to her appearance. She adjusts her glasses before attacking, suggesting precision and rigidity, a suggestion backed up by her weapon, a riding crop, appropriately named the Disciplinarian. Her attacks against the airship are interesting, purple snakes of energy bursting upon contact with the airship. Glinda also has, in this fight, strange purple sigils and glyphs, superficially similar to Weiss's, but never seen again in the show. These attacks, in particular the snakes of rubble she uses a bit later, are representative of her semblance, telekinesis. Roman, retreating further into the airship, tells a mysterious figure piloting the ship that we've got a huntress, our first use of another one of the core concepts of the show. The figure stands to confront Glinda, who, presumably with the use of dust, summons a storm of ice crystals from above. The mysterious figure, Cinderfall, one of the primary antagonists of the show and, I would argue, a main character of nearly equal importance to the main 4, steps out, and the first thing we see of her are her glass heels. From here we already know her illusion, Cinderella. We can also see, very briefly, a mysterious tattoo on her back between her shoulder blades, in the rough shape of two high heels pressed together to make a heart in the negative space. This is her emblem, which pays off later both in the plot and symbolically. Cinder almost immediately turns the tide of the battle, her dress glowing in intricate patterns as she shoots fireballs at Glinda. We see her using the same symbols as with Glinda, but colored orange. These only appear one other time in the show, when Cinder is making her escape from the CCT in Volume 2. These symbols are therefore either an early concept of how aura and semblances would look, quickly abandoned, or some type of early concept for magic. Either way, the design was clearly abandoned relatively quickly. With Glinda also taken off guard, RWBY takes a few pot shots at Cinder, trying her best but clearly at a loss for what else to do, and surprised that a fully fledged huntress has been fought to a standstill. Cinder, however, simply blocks her shots with an open palm. The visual effect used here is later used for the fight between Amber and Cinder's crew. This implies that this is Cinder using her half-maiden powers here, perhaps disguising them as just a regular use of her aura. She then uses what we now know as her semblance, to distract Glinda and RWBY long enough to escape. RWBY's first reaction, after the battle is over, is to ask for Glinda's autograph. This leads to a pretty funny hard cut into RWBY being interrogated or reprimanded for what happened. This tells us a few things about the setting. One is that huntresses are both rare and admirable, and the other is that this isn't a setting where random acts of vigilantism are rewarded, even if no one was hurt, except perhaps the bad guys. Luckily for RWBY, however, she is saved from any consequences by Ozpin, who a first-time viewer would recognize as the second voice from the intro. The music shifts to his mysterious, enchanting leitmotif. Between that, his dark green academic design, the cane, and his general chill but friendly demeanor, he comes off as a pretty typical example of the mysterious old wizard/mentor trope. His first words to RWBY are equally mysterious and very significant to the plot. First, finally stating her name for the audience, and then,
"You have silver eyes."
While the meaning of this should be obvious to anyone who's up to date with the show, and in fact, this line is directly referenced at the end of Volume 3 when it's explained what silver eyes are, we can glean some additional information here. Specifically, the Ozpin is surprised that RWBY has silver eyes. This is interesting because it implies that Summer, Ty, and Crow, all working closely with Ozpin for most of their adult lives, and for Crow for likely over 20 years and as his entire life's work, hid her from him, both never letting him meet her and never telling him that she has her mother's eyes. RWBY clearly doesn't know what to make of this, which, considering how quickly he moves on from the subject, Ozpin clearly takes to mean that she isn't aware of how important her eyes are. Instead, he takes to subtly probing her about her personal life by asking where she learned to use a scythe, which he describes as one of the most dangerous weapons ever designed, and expressing disbelief that Signal Academy would teach such a thing. When she meekly replies that it was one teacher in particular, he immediately says, "I see," and then proceeds, after handing her an entire plate of cookies, to subtly prompt her, without asking her directly, into saying that Crow, the only other scythe wielder of that skill that he knows, is her uncle and trained her. What's interesting here is how he carefully manipulates her, getting information from her without directly asking or even letting her know that he wants this information. Clearly, with what we know from the rest of the series, he is hiding that he knows her dad, knew her mother, and is basically her uncle's boss. In hiding that, it sure seems like her parents intentionally kept her away from him. He continues by asking why she's at an academy designed to train warriors, giving us an explanation as to what Signal is, as well as reinforcing the idea that this is a world where the ability to fight is important and common enough that schools for training teenagers in combat exist. This is another example of Ozpin leading her into saying something he already knows. With basically her entire family being huntsmen and huntresses, there's only one real reason why she would be at Signal. But he needs an excuse to do what he's come here to do, invite her to Beacon. Although it's never explicitly stated, based on future chapters, we can make a pretty good guess that the reason Ozpin invited RWBY to Beacon early is because he believed that that was the only way to keep her safe. Whether or not Taeyang agrees or disagrees is unclear. I wouldn't be surprised if at some point it's revealed that he put up a fight to try and stop her from going. But on the other hand, she was already clearly preparing to attend anyway, so it was only a matter of time. And getting into fights with criminals on the streets of Vale would not be conducive to keeping her a secret from Salem. So perhaps by now her cover, that she didn't even know she was keeping, was simply blown. All that being said, this is also where we get our first definition of the word huntress. Someone who fights monsters. Again, given what we've seen in the trailers and in the opening exposition, this reinforces that this is a world where there are monsters to be slain. While we don't see that much of the Grimm this volume, and what we do see doesn't paint them as particularly threatening, not to our main characters at least, all of this pushes the idea that this is a world constantly under threat and in need of defending. As Ruby starts to ramble on wanting to be a huntress, the camera slowly pans in, focusing on her as she gets lost in her excitement. Back in the Red trailer, as I explained in the first episode of RWBY In-Depth Analysis, she's portrayed as an embodiment of death, cloaked in red and black, wielding a scythe and sniper rifle, coolly and calmly cutting down a swarm of horrible monsters. But here, she comes off as an energetic and dorky teenager, who loves cookies and desperately wants to be a huntress and help people like her parents taught her to. This dichotomy is intentional. Ruby's framing as a symbol of death is not because she is death, or a killer, or anything like that, but because she is a protector against death, someone who immerses herself into the darkness so others don't have to, someone who can do all of this without becoming a monster herself. In the words of Maria in Volume 6, she is a mirror, reflecting the light of the world onto darkness. So often, people seem to base their entire perception of who Ruby is as a character on only the most bare-bones, surface-level reading of this one scene. A naive, energetic, even stupid young girl who only eats cookies. Seriously, people need to get over the cookies. It's just a fun little joke. Everyone eats cookies like that. Ruby is not naive. She is not stupid. Very much the opposite, in fact, including this early on. Naivety or stupidity has never been one of Ruby's flaws. I'll be getting much more in depth into Ruby's character later, and probably repeating these points multiple times because it is very important to the show and its themes. Optimism is not naivety. Anyway, let's take this moment to also discuss these characters' illusions. Glinda and Ozpin both are very obvious as to what their illusions are, and having these three characters together also gives light to the fact that Ruby has a second illusion, one of the very few characters that does. All three of these characters serve as allusions to the Wizard of Oz, and this is one of the core references of this show, which the plot is built around, despite not sharing many actual similarities to the plot of Wizard of Oz. From it, still, we can predict many future events in the show. That Ruby will have to follow a yellow brick road to make her way home, that Ozpin is hiding a great and terrible secret, the existence of a scarecrow who's lost his mind, Tin Woodsman who's lost his heart, and a lion who's lost his courage, and of course a wicked witch of the West to tie them all together. Ozpin, of course, accepts her into Beacon unexpectedly. This leaves Glinda rolling her eyes and sighing the sigh of a bureaucrat at the whims of someone who doesn't care about rules, and Ruby ecstatic. To many, this, and the confrontation at the dust store that led to this, could be seen as the impetus for the whole plot, but it's really not. The entire plot of the show, everything that happens in Volume 3 and beyond, is already well underway at this point. If Ruby hadn't stopped the robbery or been invited to Beacon 2 years early, the only thing that would be significantly different is that Ruby isn't involved. A big difference to be sure, but my point is that Ruby starts in media res. This first chapter isn't the start of the story, but the start of the main character's participation in the story, even if unknowingly. One more thing I'd like to point out before I move on is the lighting and framing in this scene. At the start, the frame has Ruby isolated in the spotlight, under focus and pressure. As the scene progresses, the framing shifts from depicting her as cut off and lower than her interrogators, in a position of weakness, to being on even footing, separated not by positions of power, but by the light and dark, a barrier that they are inviting Ruby to cross, from the lighthearted and carefree life of a child into the darker and more dangerous world of a huntress. This is, at its core, a coming-of-age story. We get a neat little transition as we meet Yang, with Ruby's elation swiftly transitioning to dismay at the cruel realities of getting bumped up 2 years into the same grade as her older sister. This transition represents a time skip of unknown duration, possibly even months, to the start of Beacon's school year, which, as I mentioned in the Red trailer analysis, most likely starts in the spring. Regardless, here we get more characterization for Ruby, and for Yang when she's not destroying nightclubs for information. Yang is a loving and proud older sister, genuinely excited that Ruby has been moved up. Ruby, meanwhile, is embarrassed by the attention this might bring, giving us the iconic line about wanting to be a normal girl with normal knees. Ruby and Yang are obviously close. Something else interesting here is the discussion over whether or not Ruby is special, with RWBY saying that she doesn't want other people to think she is, and Yang being sure that she is. This tiny bit of additional characterization continues to pay off for RWBY, with an entire volume being about RWBY's imposter syndrome. The two are interrupted by an expository news report, on a floating holographic screen, further establishing the sci-fi overtones of the setting. This finally gives us Roman's name, reveals that he is a known nefarious criminal, and confirms that he is still on the loose, clearly setting up that he'll return later. A fun little fact is that Roman was originally only intended to appear in Volume 1, but the writers had so much fun with his character that they decided to keep him around for Volumes 2 and 3. Additionally, his mugshots here have an Easter egg, his prisoner ID number ending in 1453, the year of the fall of Constantinople, and therefore the Eastern Roman Empire. We then get introduced to Lisa Lavender, an extremely minor but recurring news anchor character, here animated in 2D. Interestingly, the globe behind her has the correct map of remnants, not including the additional continents seen in the map in the intro. Lisa goes on to provide some exposition, marking the official first mention of both the Faunus and the White Fang, in that a Faunus civil rights protest was disrupted by the latter. She also explicitly states that the White Fang used to be peaceful. The purpose of this is to provide a brief introduction to the Faunus and the Fang, and also serves as one of only a few examples of more ordinary White Fang activities, in contrast to the more extreme attacks they carry out under the direction of Cinder and Adam. The news is cut off by a hologram of Glinda, welcoming them to Beacon. We finally get her name. Her wording is interesting. She says that these freshmen are among a privileged few who have received the honor of being selected to attend this prestigious academy. Given that there has never been any mention of a tuition or anything of the like for attending Beacon, this leads me to believe that students who pass the entrance exams, perhaps just the top scoring students, are admitted to Beacon completely free of charge. Given the dire need for huntsmen and huntresses, this would certainly make more sense than locking the training behind a paywall, and it also lines up with how Blake, Nora, and Ren could all go from living in the wilderness to attending. She also mentions that they are in an incredible time of peace. This and the opening monologue are of course set up, and foreshadowing, for that peace coming to an end. With the hologram disappearing, the freshmen on the airship get a view of the city of Vale underneath them, one of only a few views of the city that we get. Much like the background characters that the crew couldn't yet afford to fully render, the city is shown largely in silhouettes. However, some buildings can be made out, including an elevated highway, which we briefly saw in the yellow trailer and see again in Volume 2. The city has a vaguely European style in its architecture here, notably different from the tiny glimpse we got in the yellow trailer. According to RWBY, Signal Academy can be seen from the airship. Speaking of, this is our first good view of the airship, with two sets of huge flapping fins, possibly for steering, possibly containing gravity dust. This airship design is seen briefly in Volume 2, but after that is most likely replaced by a redesign. RWBY and Yang manage to have a tender moment, RWBY comforting herself that she isn't too far from home, and Yang reminding her that Beacon is their home now, only to be interrupted by the only other character on the airship to have a textured model, Jean Arc, being violently airsick. This, of course, is one of the show's longest recurring jokes and references, with RWBY giving him the nickname Vomit Boy, not knowing he's going to become one of her closest and most trusted friends. And with that, the first chapter of RWBY comes to a close, fading to black on a beautiful view of the airship approaching Beacon, a fortress set on a cliff, surrounded by waterfalls. Now, of course, we get to the opening, played at the end only for the first chapter of each volume. The theme for this volume is, of course, This Will Be the Day, as was previously heard. This song serves not just as the theme of this volume, but perhaps the entire show. We fade in from black onto a cloaked RWBY, red petals blowing away from her cloak, kneeling and slowly rising before her mother's gravestone. She looks up to see her mother, in a white cloak facing away, standing unreachable on the other side of the gravestone, only to dissolve away into white petals. The full moon itself dissolves, briefly taking its iconic shattered look, before a burst of light passes over RWBY, leading to the RWBY logo, engulfed in rose petals.
They see you as small and helpless. They see you as just a child. Surprised when they find out that a warrior will soon run wild.
The first 4 lines of the song are about being underestimated, taking the world by surprise, and achieving greatness, becoming a warrior, coming of age. We get a quick look of the other 3 girls, how they were in their trailers, at the start of their journeys. Weiss, isolated and alone in a huge arena, in the spotlight of her father's attention. Blake, alone in the wilderness, the specter of Adam hanging over her, disappearing the moment she's out of sight. Yang, determined, bold, in search of something, and incomplete.
Prepare for your greatest moments. Prepare for your finest hour. The dream that you've always dreamed is suddenly about to flower.
Again, this opening to the song is about ramping upward into greatness, about reaching out and achieving the future that belongs to you. We see the antagonists, an army of Grimm standing in a vast white void, our first good look at their first designs, transitioning into Roman and his goons, only to be replaced in flames by Cinder, still cast in darkness with only one eye and the pattern of dust in her dress glowing, as well as two silhouettes standing behind her, Emerald and Mercury. The camera zooms into her eye, hard cutting to a zoom out from a mysterious ball of darkness. Lightning is bright, sharp, and shocking, powerful and impossible to ignore. We reach out, straying beyond what we know and what others expect from us. The use of the words miracles and ancient wonder directly foreshadow significant plot developments far in the future. Our heroes are, quite literally, working miracles in a world of ancient wonders. We see our four heroes, back to back, weapons drawn, surrounded by darkness and glowing red eyes, besieged on all sides. RWBY looks up in surprise and shock as the orb of darkness blasts down at them, but all four girls recover and attack back. The camera zooms back into the darkness, before fading back in and pulling out on the statue in the beacon courtyard, and Jean Arc staring up in worry at it, before Pyrrha, Ren, and Nora appear beside him, marking their first appearances. They look up, cutting to Ozpin, specifically his cane, and Glinda, standing on the deck of an airship among a whole fleet of airships, traveling forwards with great power towards some unseen destination. We see each of our girls standing in darkness, their respective symbols behind them. RWBY staring directly forward, worried. Weiss wielding Mert and Aster, steadfast. Blake reaching for Gamble Shroud, eyes closed and face tilted down. Yang looking upwards and onwards to the left of the screen. The shot fades in on Ozpin's face, zooming out on our whole cast, each standing in a pose one would expect from their surface level appearances. Till we come to RWBY, where we hard cut to her silhouette before the full moon, twirling crescent rows before we land on the logo. Beautiful. Through all of this, the chorus of the song.
This'll be the day we've waited for. This'll be the day we open up the door.
We continue to focus on the idea that this is the beginning of not just a great future, but one we've been preparing for, the start of an opportunity. This part is interesting. Absolution, meaning release from guilt or punishment, is being rejected. Forgiveness is unimportant. And revolution, radical change, is coming whether we like it or not.
Welcome to a world of new solutions. Welcome to a world of bloody evolution.
Here we get a hint of something darker. This is the beginning of a new world, a future of new solutions to old problems, and of change and improvement born through destruction. These ending lines set up the entire rest of the show. Growth, minds being changed, reinforcing the framing of this in terms of stories and fairy tales, and reiterating that theme we heard earlier. Victory is in a simple soul. Of course, the song has a second verse not included here, and that verse is significantly darker and more foreboding. But perhaps I'll analyze that some other time. Overall, this theme and opening establish the basics of our characters at the start of their journeys, and makes clear that this is only the start of a journey, one leading to greatness, to strife and conflict, to change. And with that, we close out the very first chapter of RWBY. Overall, this chapter is a promising start, elevated by what RWBY becomes later. Far from flawless, particularly in the animation and voice acting. You can tell they were operating on a shoestring budget. But more than anything, what I see in this first chapter is heart. They poured everything they could into this. Careful characterization, a blend of fun combat and lighthearted humor, and foreshadowing and setup for a future that they had no idea they'd actually get to make. This chapter was the start of a decade-long journey, for the crew and for us. They never gave up. through criticism and harassment, losing funding, their company, their loved ones, so neither will I. Next time I'll be analyzing Chapter 2, The Shining Beacon, Parts 1 and 2. Unfortunately, I can't guarantee when it will come out, but rest assured I'm working to make it as quickly as I can. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed and want to see more of this, consider subscribing. And remember, never stop moving forward.